Okay, so for our last 2 weeks of the class, which start next week, we're going to be looking at biblical textual criticism. Basically, how do we know the text that we have of the Bible today is the same as what was written? And textual criticism depends on the manuscripts that we have, all the handwritten copies of the Bible, either as a whole or various parts of it, that were created over a period of, about 1,500 years or so. And so it's a sort of a lead into that. Today we're going to look at those manuscripts. We're going to see, how they were created, what type of materials were used. We're going to look at a lot of the important manuscripts, the ones that we actually use to really base what we know of as the Bible on. And because of those evidences, because of all these manuscripts we have, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and others, we know, for example, that the Old Testament has remained virtually unchanged since the time of Jesus. And we have thousands and thousands of New Testament manuscripts that also show us that the New Testament has been very well preserved. And in areas which it wasn't, we'll talk about that next time. But today we're going to be looking at the physical manuscripts themselves. And then next week and the week after, we'll basically be saying, what do we do with these? So first, the term manuscript itself means a handwritten document. So any handwritten document is a manuscript. Obviously, most of these are going to predate the printing press. And that's important because once you have the printing press, obviously that cuts down a lot of errors. You don't get a lot of changes in the text from then on because you're making identical copies. So to see any changes that crop up in the text over time, we really do have to look at the manuscripts, the handwritten copies that were made, from about the time of Jesus up to around the time of Gutenberg. And we have two terms to describe them. Extant, that's E-X-T-A-N-T, extant manuscripts are manuscripts that have been preserved, which again, we have thousands of them, and hopefully there are still many more left to be discovered. Then extinct manuscripts are the manuscripts that have been lost, which would be by far the largest majority of them. I mean, most of the manuscripts that have been made of the Bible and pretty much any other ancient book as well have been lost over time. Either they've just fallen apart or degraded, or they've literally just been lost. We don't know where they are. So early manuscripts were written on papyrus. And this is papyrus here. Papyrus is a reed that grows along the banks of the Nile in Egypt, which is why it was Egyptians who first actually invented papyrus in writing. Okay, there it is. And basically you take these reeds and you can use them to make a very rough form of paper. It's not what we would think of as paper today, but it served that purpose very early on. Now, the nice thing about papyrus is that when it's in a hot, dry climate like Egypt and the Dead Sea region and really a lot of the Middle East, it can actually survive for millennia. If it's in the right conditions, it can last for a very long time. Which is why we still have quite a few old papyruses preserved. And, again, it's not just the Bible. We have a lot of old Egyptian papyruses and things like that as well. So to make papyrus, quote, paper, and we do get the word paper from papyrus, even though we don't use papyrus to make paper anymore. But to make papyrus paper, first you took the reed. You gathered a bunch of them. You stripped the outer rind off of them. So you're just after the inner sort of pulp. And then you cut it into about 18-inch pieces. And then the inner pith, the inner part of the papyrus, was cut into narrow slices. And then those slices are laid side by side with their ends slightly overlapping. So you have a bunch of very narrow slices of the inner part of this reed. You lay them side by side. There's edges slightly overlapping. Then you take another set of slices and lay those over in the opposite direction. So you have a bunch of vertical slices, and then over top you have a bunch of horizontal slices.
It took forever to put together.
Yeah, well, pretty much anything involving writing used to be a very, very tedious, involved process, which is why most of the population was illiterate. Historical studies have shown that as soon as reading and writing materials become easily available, then literacy just skyrockets. Because if you think about it, unlike English, most languages, it's not hard to learn to read them if you know how to speak them. For the most part, they just, you spell things as you hear them. So learning reading is easy. The problem is having reading material. So yeah, pretty much anything involving paper or writing, and for thousands of years before the inventing of the printing press, was a very long, tedious, involved process. So you had these two sheets of these papyrus strips laid over top of each other, one horizontal, one vertical. You then took these two sheets, pressed them together, and you beat them until their natural juices basically fused them all together into a single sheet that looked like that. And so you now have a single sheet of this inner part of the papyrus. It's still very wet because it still has all those natural juices. So then they're dried. And after drying, the surface is polished smooth by, using something like a round rock. You just, rub it on it to smooth out the surface. And then you cut the sheet, which, would have a bunch of edges and stuff and all that. But you cut it into a nice, neat rectangle. And this is what you get. This is a piece of papyrus paper. And this is recent. They still make papyrus. For calligraphy and stuff. Artsy type things. You can buy papyrus. And this is what it looks like. And you can clearly see where those strips once were, horizontal and vertical.
Do they still make it like that in today's world?
I'm sure it's mechanized to some extent,
Yes,
but
yeah.
as far as I know, the basic process would still be the same. I mean, that's just how you make it. I'm sure all the cutting and smashing and all this is done by machine now. Though I'm sure there's somebody out there doing it by hand to make it, make it authentic. So you have these papyrus sheets. They're usually about 15 inches high by 9 inches wide. So larger than a normal sort of sheet of paper that we would use nowadays. But you didn't use them as single sheets. Rather, you take these sheets and you glue them together into a long strip to make a scroll. And so, throughout ancient history, really until just after the time of Jesus, the scroll was what people wrote in. You had your papyrus, you stitched it together, you rolled it up, and you had a scroll. And until about the 5th century A.D., because Jewish people used scrolls longer than Christians, and we'll talk about that. But until about the 5th century A.D., Jewish scholars would have the Torah on one big scroll. And if you go into a synagogue, they still do. They'll have a Torah scroll, usually just for ceremonial purposes. It is in some big, they call it an ark, and it's huge. If you ever go to the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., you can look at some of these. But they really are gigantic. So they'd have one scroll for the Torah and then several more scrolls for the rest of the scriptures. And, this is why you didn't really have a single order for the Bible books until much later, because all it was a collection of scrolls. There wasn't an order. It was just here are our scrolls here. Pick out the one you need. Now, this was sort of your everyday paper. As everyday as paper got back then. If you wanted something nicer, if you wanted something more expensive, on the other hand, you would use parchment. or what's called vellum, which is basically just really expensive parchment. And the difference is that parchment's made of animal skin, usually something like calf or sheep skin. And parchment is made a bit differently. With parchment, you first started with a very fine, unflawed skin. You wanted skin that, didn't have any splotches or any bumps or anything on it. You really wanted a nice, even, fine writing surface. You then took the skin and you soaked it in a solution of slaked lime for several days. And then when it's nice and wet, you would take it and you'd stretch it over a wooden frame. So you'd stretch it out and it would dry like that, which again would make it very, very flat. You'd then take a long curved knife and scrape the hair and the flesh off. Then you washed what was left over the skin to remove the lime, and then you stretched it tight again to dry. And then once you had that, you had to scrape the skin over and over and over again until it was smooth and very thin. Again, you're looking for something like paper thin. So they just scraped it over and over again. And then once you had that, you once again cut the parchment in sheets. Parchment is something that's also very, very much still available. Most people who do calligraphy do it on parchment. College degrees are printed on parchment, usually things like that. So it's still really easy to come by.
Is the parchment that's used for college diplomas, etc., is that strictly a skinned fabric?
Yeah, it's not. If it's not skin, it's not parchment.
Okay.
Now, for ink, you had to have certain inks for papyrus, certain inks for parchment. For papyrus, general everyday ink that you use for writing your shopping list or whatever was usually just a mixture of charcoal and water, so just black water almost. For parchment, you make them from oak galls, like the big, bulbous things that grow out of oak trunks. And you take those and the material inside them, use that, and you use iron sulfate. So you mix those together and make an oil, and make an ink for parchment. And again, that was for your regular everyday parchments. If you wanted something really nice, you could make ink that was actually made from gold and silver. And they would make purple parchment. So you could have purple parchment and writing on it in gold or silver ink to create a very nice, sort of a deluxe special edition parchment. And we'll see pictures of that later on today. Some of the results of that. So that's what you write it on. And again, to make a scroll, you take a bunch of papyrus, glue them together. Or with parchment, you'd actually sew the sheets together to make a scroll. And you'd basically just make it long and roll it around one or two dowels, like just, wooden sticks. Scrolls are usually no longer than about 30 feet. And in fact, some of the longer, like Gospels, for example, would have taken up one complete scroll. Now, when you wrote on scrolls, you didn't just write like straight across. Scrolls are written on in columns. Not too different than what you see in a Bible today. Bibles are printed in columns. Same thing with a scroll. The column is usually about 2.5 to 3.5 inches wide. And you'd only write on one side. You'd write on the lighter side of the surface because, again, you're rolling it up for a scroll. So you don't want writing on the outer side. You want writing on the inside where it's going to be protected.
Is it written from left to right or right to left?
Depends on the language. Like Hebrew would be written, right to left.
Okay.
Greek or Latin would be written left to right. That's purely a language thing. Now that's for scrolls. However, interestingly, by the end of the 1st century AD, Christians had, for the most part, stopped using scrolls and moved on to what's known as the Codex, C-O-D-E-X. And the Codex is actually just what we would call a book. This is a codex. And by the end of the 1st century, the Codex was actually the preferred form for Christian writings. And Christians really kind of led the way in this. Christians were sort of on the bleeding edge of technology there because the Codex was very new. But it was very good for Christians because it was very portable. And it was something that, you could have your little codex and you could hide it if you needed to. It wasn't some giant scroll. They were just very convenient. So to make a codex, you take sheets of papyrus, you fold them in half, and insert one inside the other. So, you have a bunch of sheets folded in half, you place one inside the other, and then you'd stitch those together on one side to make, and you'd have something called a quire. That's Q-U-I-R-E, not C-H-O-I-R. So a quire, Q-U-I-R-E, and it was just a bunch of pieces of papyrus folded in half, stuck inside each other, sewed along one side. And then, if you needed more space in that, you could take several quires, stack them on top of each other, and then glue them together to create a larger codex. And then a lot of times that would be put inside something like a leather cover. And if you know anything about book binding today, we still do it that way. That's still how books are made. So look, get like a nice hardcover book and look at the spine, and you can actually see all the little quires there and how they're all glued and sewn together. If you watch like a book binder or something, and it's still done the exact same way today. So the Codex became the preferred form by the end of the 1st century. And with the Codex, they also found other ways to be convenient. For example, 2 of the codices that are the best known, the Codex Vaticanus, the Codex Alexandrinus, we'll talk about them in a bit. They were codices of the entire Bible. They were created in the early 4th century. And they actually divided the Bible into chapters. And they were among the first that we know that did. They wouldn't have been the modern chapters, but they divided it up into chapters. And then later editions actually divided those chapters into verses and so on. Though we didn't actually get our modern day chapters until 1227. A monk by the name of Stephen Langton was the first to divide the Bible into what we now use as the modern day chapters in 1227. And then we didn't get modern verse divisions until 1551. So the way we have it now is a few, centuries old, but, they were dividing the Bible up into chapters not too long after they started making these big codices. So now, any other questions before we move on?
Go back to what you said. The quire
Mm-hmm.
is numerous sheets of papyrus.
Yeah, so you take a bunch of sheets, you fold them in half, and stick one inside the other.
Yeah. But it's papyrus. It's not.
Yeah, well, you could do I think it was usually papyrus. I don't think parchment was usually done that way. So let's start by looking at what we have in terms of Old Testament manuscripts. And, obviously the Old Testament started out as the Tanakh. We talked about that before. The collection of Jewish writings of the Torah, the prophets, and basically all the rest of the books. And it started out as just those original Hebrew writings. It wasn't long, however, because remember, by Jesus' day, Jewish people weren't speaking Hebrew anymore. They were speaking Aramaic. So the Tanakh was translated into Aramaic, and when they did that, they also included this commentary So Jewish rabbis and the like would have made all these oral commentaries on the Torah over the years. And these commentaries in Aramaic did start to be included with the Tanakh itself. And those are referred to as the Targumim. Targumim, the Targumim. And these were Aramaic oral commentary that was included, almost like having a study Bible. And then we talked last time that you did eventually get the Bible translated, the Old Testament translated into Greek with the Septuagint, which included books like the Apocrypha and the like. And when that had all been done by Jesus' time, move forward till after the destruction of the temple, and you started to get more and more rabbinical commentary that was eventually collected in the Talmud. So you had, by the 5th or 6th century, this very large amount of Jewish material. All these Jewish writings, including the scripture and all these other commentaries on the scriptures. And by this point, they were trying very hard to keep a very, very accurate version of the text. And this was done by a group called the Masoretes. And they produced what's called the Masoretic text. That's Masoretic, the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text was produced by this group of scribes who produced very, very, very high quality, accurate copies of the scriptures. And this was done between about the 6th and the 8th centuries. And the Masoretic text is actually still our best and main source for the Jewish Bible. If in your Bible, almost certainly the vast majority of the New Testament was taken from this Masoretic text that was produced by these scribes. And again, it was very, very high quality. They went through a lot of effort to ensure that the text was kept correct. And now, like I said, it's still considered the best version. It's not the oldest. Until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the Masoretic text was the oldest Old Testament text we have. Now the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest.
The Masoretic text, this is probably obvious to everybody else, but not to me. What language?
Hebrew.
Still is?
Because they were copies, exact copies of the scriptures, like letter by letter copies. Now, interestingly, even though they were producing these, very accurate copies of the scriptures, they still added in like their own commentary. So you have what's called the small Masorah or the Masorah Parva. And those were notes written in the margins by the scribes about different textual variants that they found. Like if they had two manuscripts they were trying to copy over and there was a difference between them, they would make a note in the margin about that. So when you read their copy, you could see, what all the variants they had found were. So that was referred to as the small Masorah. And a lot of these scribes would also leave very extensive notes at the top or the bottom of the page, and that was referred to as the large Masorah. So, again, and this is not too dissimilar from what you see in a modern-day Bible. Most modern-day Bibles, if you look at them, either between the two columns or at the bottom of the pages, they'll have notes on different variants. They'll say, well, this manuscript reads this, but another manuscript reads this sort of thing. This is the same sort of thing that they were copying down. And these notes are very useful in showing that we do have a very accurate representation of the Bible. And we'll look at this in a lot more detail next time. But now let's actually look at some of the Masoretic manuscripts that we have today. So this is known as the Aleppo Codex, or the Codex Aleppo, if you want to be technical. You can see it was written around 930. That's AD 930. They didn't, finish up at 930 at night. The Aleppo Codex, notice it is a codex. It's not a scroll. So by this time they were using books as well. But it was still written in columns. You still had these little notes in the side, on the top and the bottom that I was talking about. You have what's the small Masorah and the large Masorah there. And again, it is written in Hebrew. So the Aleppo Codex is one of our oldest Masoretic texts, one of our oldest Masoretic manuscripts. And it is considered to be sort of the authoritative one. This is like the premium Masoretic text. It's like the best example we have. And it's about 60% complete. We don't have the whole thing. Certainly when it was first written, it would have contained the entire Tanakh, but only about 60% of it's left. And that's because it has a fairly interesting history. Now, as we said, it was written around 930, AD 930. And we can tell that because of various aspects of the writing they used, like the way they made certain letters and that sort of thing. But our knowledge of its history really begins in the 11th century. We know that there was a Jewish community in Jerusalem that bought it in the 11th century, and they later moved to Cairo. So it went from Jerusalem to Cairo. And it does appear to have been used as a model for subsequent manuscripts, like a lot of copies were made from it when it was in Cairo. Then, in 1375, it was moved from Cairo to Aleppo, Syria, which you might remember being in the news a few years ago. And in Aleppo, it was stored in a synagogue there, and it was there for several centuries until that synagogue was actually burned down by rioters in 1947. So the codex went through the fire, and you can see where it's been burned. You can tell it's been through some stuff. And because of that, we now have less than 300 of what would have originally been probably 487 pages. Though we don't know for certain what happened to the missing pages. Certainly they could have burned, or they could have been stolen. It wasn't that an unknown thing for writers to take pages from something like this as basically souvenirs. So this is an example of the Aleppo Codex. Again, a very, very high quality Masoretic text. And again, if you were to translate this to English, you get something pretty much indistinguishable from what you have in your Bible today. Next we'll look at is the Codex Leningradensis. And the Codex Leningradensis, probably written around 1008. It is the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible that we have. It's also a very, very high quality copy, very high quality parchment, and it's bound in a very nice leather cover. And it's very well preserved, which is nice because it contains a lot of artwork like this. This is the cover. So there's a lot of, very, high quality Jewish art inside it that's been preserved. It is currently held in what is now St. Petersburg in Russia. Obviously, before St. Petersburg, it was Leningrad, hence the term Codex Leningradensis. It wasn't written there. That's just where they have it now. It's some museum or something. Interestingly, the Leningradensis has the entire Tanakh, like we said, but it's divided a bit differently. Rather than having just the Torah, the prophets, and the writings are divided up into what's called the 5 megalot, and then the other writings. So basically, it's divided up differently in terms of just sections than most of Hebrew Bibles. But these are the two best examples we have of the Masoretic text. And again, very, very high quality work. Not going that much older than this, very much pre-Masoretic, probably the best known biblical manuscripts are, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written probably between about 100 BC to about AD 50. So over a period of about 150 years. They were produced by a Jewish group called the Essenes. The Essenes were another a first century Jewish sect of which there were many. Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Christians, Essenes. These were all considered different Jewish sects in the first century. So the Essenes were another one of these. The Essenes were very, very concerned with ritual purity. They believed they were an apocalyptic group. They believed that the end of the world was coming very soon. So they believed in withdrawing themselves from, the corrupt society at large and living out in these caves. They would go through washing several times a day. I don't think women were allowed. So they were kind of an odd group. But they produced a lot of copies, both of the Bible and of other books, like the Book of Enoch. They really liked the Book of Enoch. And several of their own writings as well. And it looks like that when the Romans came in to destroy Jerusalem, that they knew the Essenes, hid their writings away in these clay jars in a cave near Qumran, which is, in, I think, Saudi Arabia now, or maybe Jordan. I think it's Jordan. And these were discovered in 1947. You might have heard the story. Basically, a shepherd boy, or maybe it was a goat herd, but he was out just herding his flock in the desert, and he was bored, and so he was like tossing rocks. He tossed one into a cave and heard something break, and went in and found all these, clay pots filled with all these ancient manuscripts. So they were discovered in 1947. Initially, they kept on being discovered for a while. They're still being analyzed. There are Dead Sea Scrolls that still haven't really been studied yet. So it's a very long-term thing. The interesting thing is that when you compare the Dead Sea Scrolls of biblical books that we have, they seem almost virtually identical to the Masoretic text, with the exception of some spelling changes and the like that would have occurred over time. There doesn't appear to be much difference. So this is one of the great evidences we have that the Bible really has been preserved very well. No, go on.
I guess I'm misinterpreting what that says. This included a book of the Old Testament. Well,
again, they didn't have one book. They had a bunch of different scrolls.
Okay. But it's not specifically Isaiah.
No, Isaiah was one of them, and I was about to talk about it. But they had lots of different books. Not all of them were biblical books. They had a lot of their own writings. There were at least fragments of every Old Testament book except for Esther. And again, Esther was controversial. A lot of people didn't believe it should have been in the Bible. So the Essenes might have thought that, or maybe just their copy of Esther wasn't preserved. But they do have, and again, most of what they have are fragments, but they did have a complete book of Isaiah. So the Isaiah scroll is the oldest complete copy of any New Testament book that we have. And again, it's been found to be incredibly close to the Masoretic text. The Dead Sea Scroll, Isaiah scroll, is more than 95% identical to the Masoretic text. So very, very little change over time, because by this point, the Jews had accepted these books as scripture, and it was very important to them that they be preserved accurately. So these are some examples of Old Testament manuscripts. Again, we don't have nearly as many of them. The Old Testament is much older. We don't, that Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scroll is the oldest one we have. So, that is still, the Isaiah scroll is still about 600-700 years removed from the original book. But the Old Testament text that we have today, the one that almost certainly was used to translate your Bible, is what's called the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. I think that's in there. You don't have to copy it down. But the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia was compiled in 1977, and it's the standard edition of the Hebrew Bible that's in use today. So again, if you go and buy a Hebrew Bible, that's what you're buying. And it's based mainly on the Codex Leningradensis, since that is a very high quality, complete text of the Old Testament. But it does, there are some places where it's different, and it does have notes on variants and the like. But mainly the Codex Leningradensis is the Bible you have today in terms of the Old Testament. So we have, the Old Testament manuscripts we have are very high quality, but you can see there's not nearly as many of them, and they're much later. Again, even the Isaiah scroll is about 600 or so years after when the original book was written. New Testament manuscripts, on the other hand, are much better. We have thousands of New Testament manuscripts. In fact, when you compare the number of New Testament manuscripts we have to any other ancient book, they pale in comparison. Furthermore, the time interval between the oldest manuscripts we have and when the books were written are very small, in some cases in the order of decades, not centuries. We currently, and this number is always growing, it's always growing. There are currently over 5,700 known Greek manuscripts. Now, again, not all of these are complete. Some of them are just tiny fragments. But, over 5,700 known Greek ones. About 1,000 of which actually predate the Latin Vulgate, which was around 390. So we have about 1,000 Greek manuscripts from within about the 300 years, the first 300 years after the New Testament was written. We also have about 10,000 manuscripts of the Latin Vulgate that predate AD 1500, predate the printing press.
About how many?
About 10,000 Latin manuscripts. Which again, that's not the original language, but the Vulgate was translated from the original languages. And Jerome was a very well-respected scholar, and most people agreed he did a good job. And so that's very useful. We also have several hundred New Testament manuscripts in other languages, and we'll look at some examples of that as well. Now again, most of these are fragments. Some of them very small fragments, some of them much larger. We only have about 60 complete Greek New Testaments. But again, some of these, even these complete New Testaments, are very early when compared to most other ancient documents. Revelation is actually the least attested books. We have fewer manuscripts taken from Revelation than any other, and we've got about 300 of those. So we have about 300 manuscripts that contain some portion of Revelation. It may not be all of it, but some portion of it. Furthermore, even if we did not have a single New Testament manuscript, we could pretty much completely reconstruct it from the writings of the Church Fathers. The Church Fathers quote the New and Old Testaments so extensively that you could pretty much reconstruct the entire thing even if we didn't have a single original manuscript. Bruce Metzger, which was one of the foremost biblical scholars of the 20th century, he was Bart Ehrman's mentor, but don't hold that against him because he was very good. He said this. So extensive are these citations that if all other sources of our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. Interestingly, in a recent book, Person of Interest, J. Warner Wallace basically takes a survey of art throughout, the last 2,000 years, and he's shown that if you had nothing but just artwork, you could reconstruct every single event in the Gospels. Every single event in every single one of the Gospels has been reproduced in some painting or sculpture or something like that. Furthermore, we have other sources as well. For example, in the 2nd century, I think it was the 2nd century, I don't have the date written down here. In the 2nd century, a Christian scholar named Tatian harmonized all 4 of the Gospels. He created a harmony of the Gospels called the Diatessaron, where he just took all 4 Gospels and combined them together and tried to, combine them out chronologically so you'd have like one continuous narrative. And that alone preserved a lot of the biblical content. And in fact, for a while, the Diatessaron was more popular than the individual Gospels because, it had them all in one place in chronological order and everything. Unfortunately, no complete copy survives, but what we do have, again, is one more, piece of evidence in terms of, New Testament manuscripts. And of course, biblical manuscripts continue to be discovered. A lot of them are discovered by a group called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, led by a biblical scholar named Daniel Wallace, one of the foremost biblical scholars of our day. Very, very well-respected Greek scholar, New Testament scholar. And he actually was on the translation board for the Bible. I like to use the Net Bible. In fact, he was what told me about it. Because we had him for an Areopagus speaker once, so I got to hang out with him for a day. But what they do, what the Center of the Study for New Testament Manuscripts does, is they go out to wherever biblical manuscripts are discovered. And, this is largely Middle East, but could be, other places as well. A lot of times into very dangerous places. He's been to Iran and Iraq and all these places, and they go, and their goal is to create digital records of every single New Testament manuscript we have. So they have like a camera rate that they take, and they take pictures of every single page of these manuscripts. And they're very careful with them. They take a page and they turn it and take the next page. So they are in the process of digitizing every known New Testament manuscript to preserve them. And they're also, always looking for new ones. So they've made lots of discoveries as well. They're sort of like, Indiana Jones if he was about biblical manuscripts. No, seriously. That's what it seems like sometimes. I was talking to one of Dan's students, and I told him how jealous I was. He got to do this cool stuff. And you can go online and see. The whole point is to preserve it for anyone who any scholars. You can go online and look at these images that they've taken of all these old manuscripts. And, some of these New Testament manuscripts are from scrolls, but again, Christians were among the first to adopt the Codex. So a lot of these ancient manuscripts are codices. So let's take a look at some of them. First of all, a bit about naming and organization, because every manuscript is given a unique name. Usually not something, fancy like Codex Leningradensis or whatever, but it's like a number sort of thing. But you can divide the Greek manuscripts into 4 major groups. You have the papyri. These are the oldest, and the papyri, for the most part, we have are from the 2nd to the 7th centuries. Again, the earliest manuscript we have so far dates to the probably about 125, AD 125. So that's early 2nd century. It's a papyrus. So from about the 2nd to the 7th century, most of what we have are papyri. And they're denoted by a capital P, like in a number. So if when you're looking at lists and stuff, it's P something tells you that manuscript is the papyrus. Then you have what's called the majuscule, or uncial, majuscule, majuscule, or uncial is uncial, uncial rather. These are somewhat later manuscripts. They date from about the 4th to the 9th century. They're written on parchment, and they're written only using capital letters, which is what uncial means. It's an old style of writing that only used capital letters. And, majuscule, maj means large, so large letter. Then the next we have are the minuscules. And these are manuscripts, again, written on parchment, essentially with the Greek version of cursive. So, they're, it's basically written almost like a different handwriting, a different font. And they're, a little bit later. Finally, you have books that aren't actually biblical manuscripts at all, but they're what are called lectionaries. And a lectionary is like what you'd read aloud in church. If you've ever been to a Catholic church and they have their liturgy, everything's all written out, everything that you read and the audience says and all that. That's what a lectionary is. And there's a lot of scripture in that. There's a lot of Bible quotations and stuff. So lectionaries are also very useful for, biblical study because a lot of the New Testaments and Old Testaments have been preserved there. And these are usually written in minuscule as well. So we currently, and again, this number might have changed by now. I haven't updated it since for a bit. We currently have at least 18 2nd century manuscripts. That's from between 100 and 199. So we have 18 from there. We have more than 60 from before AD 300. So these are very, very early manuscripts back from before when Christianity was even legal. Obviously, once Christianity became legal and protected, the number of manuscripts is much larger because now it's much safer to produce them.
Say those numbers again for me.
We have at least 18 2nd century manuscripts and more than 60 from before AD 300. Now, interestingly, back in 1972, a man named Jose O'Callaghan claimed that the Dead Sea Scrolls actually contained some New Testament material. But the manuscript he was using to make the claim is very low quality. It's very hard to tell what's actually written on it. So it's a very controversial claim. But there have been some people who suggested that at least the later Essenes might have actually at least been interested in Jesus and Christianity. Of course, then you'll have the people who claim that Jesus was really just an Essene, but if you know anything about them, you know that can't be the case. So these early manuscripts, they're almost all Greek because, of course, that's what the Bible was originally written in. You probably didn't get any translation into Latin until about the end of the 2nd century, and that was kind of piecemeal. You didn't really get a single sort of big Latin translation until the 300s and the Latin Vulgate. Then when you had the Latin Vulgate, it was actually the official Roman Catholic Bible for, 1,600 years. And the Vulgate came about when the Bishop of Rome, Damasus I, D-A-M-A-S-U-S, not Damascus. It looks kind of like Damascus, but it's Damasus I. The Bishop of Rome at the time, he commissioned a scholar named Jerome to produce an official Latin translation of the Bible in 983. And Jerome's goal was to produce a functional equivalent. Remember, he was going more idea for idea than word for word. And he actually justified this because the New Testament writers will sometimes quote the Old Testament somewhat freely. The New Testament writers didn't always quote the Old Testament word for word. So he felt that justified taking sort of a freer approach to the text. So that's where we really get the start of our Latin manuscripts. And again, we have about 10,000 manuscript copies of the Vulgate up until around 1500. The next big language for it to be translated into was Old Syriac. And Syriac was a language that was very, very closely related to Aramaic, which of course is what Jesus spoke. Not the same language, but very closely related to it. In fact, you do get some confusion there. Some people will claim that, we have an Aramaic translation of an old Aramaic translation. We don't. What we have is Old Syriac. But they're very closely related. And this was done around AD 200. This was like sort of the first big translation project for the New Testament. And the standard Old Syriac Bible became known as the Peshitta, Peshitta. And interestingly, the Peshitta actually excludes 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation, which you remember were some of the more controversial books. And it is actually still the standard Bible for the Eastern Syriac churches. There is a Eastern Syriac Catholic Church, and it's still their standard Bible. And a lot of times when people will say, if they go, if you read the Aramaic, words of Jesus, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the Peshitta. Next, after Syriac, you then get Coptic translations. Coptic, the Copts, are essentially the original inhabitants of Egypt. Now, the people who live in Egypt nowadays are mostly Arabs. They due to all the Islamic, invasions. But the Copts are the original inhabitants of Egypt. They're still around. They're still there. They were Christians, and the Bible was translated into Coptic probably around 300. Most likely not from the original languages. Most likely the Coptic version was translated from the Septuagint and the New Testament from Latin. But we currently have over 1,000 Coptic manuscripts. Interestingly, the Coptic Christianity is actually a little bit different. It's what's called non-Chalcedonian Christianity, which means they actually have a somewhat different view of the nature of Christ than Catholics or Protestants would have. It's not a big deal. It's one of those things that most people wouldn't think much about if they heard about it. But technically, to the Catholics, they're heretics, because they're non-Chalcedonian. But you'll hear about them some nowadays because they're undergoing a lot of persecution and the like. Because they're still in Egypt. They're still around. Next we have Gothic. The Bible is translated into Gothic. This has nothing to do with listening to The Cure and wearing makeup. The Goths were a Germanic tribe. And the Bible was translated into Gothic by a man named Ulfilas, 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 known as the Apostle to the Goths. He did this in the 4th century. And 6 Gothic manuscripts have survived, and this is one of them. This is the Codex Argentius. This is a Gothic manuscript, translated or produced around 525. And notice that it contains the 4 Gospels in what's referred to as the Western order. So Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark. That was just some early Bibles have the Gospels in that order. Notice that it is one of the nice fancy ones. It's written on purple parchment with silver ink. So this, when it was produced, would have been a very, very nice copy of the four Gospels. So this one was really nice. The other 5 Gothic manuscripts we have are what are known as palimpsests. Palimpsests. A palimpsest is a manuscript, a parchment, that the original writing on it has been scraped off and something new is written on top. And a lot of times churches would take old biblical manuscripts that, were getting old and falling apart, or they just didn't see any use for anymore, and they would scrape it off and then they write something else on top. They'd have prayer books or hymnals or other things written on top of them. And so the other 5 Gothic biblical manuscripts we have are all palimpsests. So they've all been scraped clean and some non-biblical text written on top. Fortunately, modern technology using infrared light and things like that allow us to read the original writing now. But back then, it would have been difficult to tell. Next, after the Goths, you had the Armenians. Remember, Armenia is over just next to Turkey, south of Russia. Armenia was actually the first kingdom to make Christianity the official religion. It predated Rome doing it. Armenia became an official Christian country in the late 200s. And an Armenian translation of the Bible was eventually completed around 414. And because Christianity was legal so early there, that means the Armenians created a very large number of manuscripts. And we actually have more Armenian manuscripts than anything else other than the Latin Vulgate. We have over 2,000 Armenian manuscripts are extant. And again, these are important, even though they're not the original language, because they were translated hopefully from the originals. They still give us a check. They give us a way of trying to see, what the originals might have said. And like a lot of those sort of Eastern churches, the Armenians' Bible contains books that most other people's Bibles don't. So a lot of the apocryphal books are in there as well. Next we had Georgian. The New Testament was translated into Georgian probably by the mid-5th century. So y'all can holler on down to the local bookstore, pick up a local Georgian translation of the New Testament. Ever heard of it? Y'all ever seen the Cotton Patch Gospel? That's what I'm visualizing here. Georgian. No. I'm presuming y'all know what Georgia is. Again, one of those countries south of Georgia near Armenia. They have a very, very different. It's one of those languages where you have a word this long and there's one vowel. But we had the Bible translated into Georgian by the 5th century. We have about 43 extant Georgian manuscripts dating from about the 8th and 9th centuries. And then Ethiopia started Christianizing early. The Ethiopian eunuch that Philip talked to. And as far as we know, Ethiopia was fully Christianized by the early 6th century, though Ethiopians will claim that it was much earlier, that they were the first Christian country. They claim a lot of things. But the Bible was translated into the Ethiopian language by the mid-500s. And we have over 600 Ethiopic manuscripts. Then you had the Bible translated into Arabic, probably about the 8th century or so. And then you have the Bible translated into Slavonic, the language of the Slavs, which they actually created the Cyrillic alphabet in order to be able to translate the Bible into the Slavic language. And of course, that's what Russian and all those languages are written nowadays. And in fact, the Russian Orthodox Church still uses the Old Slavonic Bible. That is their official translation. And we have over 4,000 Slavic manuscripts. So all these different manuscripts, all these different languages. We'll again take a look now at some of the most important and interesting ones. So manuscripts are classified according to what's called the CRG system, where again capital P indicates a papyrus. A major parchment codex, like the really big important ones, are assigned just a single capital letter, like A, B, C, D, etc. And then vellum manuscripts, the really nice ones, are given a 0 number. It's 0 and then something. So the earliest New Testament manuscript we have, the very first one that we've been able to get our hands on so far, is this. This is P52. Again, P indicates it is a papyrus, otherwise known as the John Rylands manuscript. The John Rylands manuscript is about the size of a postage stamp. It's about 2.5 by 3.5 inches. A bit larger than a postage stamp, but it's about like that. Something like that or so. And it contains 5 verses from John 18. Even though it is a papyrus, it's written front and back, so you have a picture of both sides there. And again, yes, we call this a manuscript, even though it's so small. Any fragment is a manuscript, and it gets counted. It was produced probably around 125. Again, you'll read different dates ranging from about 110 to about 150, but most scholars will settle around the 125 range. So it is the oldest currently known New Testament manuscript. There was actually some excitement recently they thought that they had found a 1st century manuscript of Mark, but it turned out to be a mistake. Very disappointing. It was huge news as a whole thing. If you're plugged into that. So this, even though it's small, is incredibly important, not just because it's the oldest, but because for a long time, scholars, non-Christian, secular scholars, really worked hard to late date the Gospels. They really wanted to be able to say that the Gospels were written in the 2nd century at the earliest, and therefore be able to say, well, they're very late, which means they're legendaries, which means they're not reliable. This one tiny piece of papyrus blew that entire thing out of the water. Because it's from the Gospel of John, which virtually every scholar will agree was the last one written. And it's from about 125. Now, it's highly unlikely that this is a fragment of the original Gospel. It's highly unlikely that it's a 1st generation copy. So it's probably several generations removed, which more or less forces the Gospel of John to have been written in, at the very latest, 80, 90s or so, but definitely 1st century. So this one tiny little bit of papyrus blew away decades and decades of skeptical scholarship, just by, being what it is. So it is incredibly important. Another important set of manuscripts are what are known as the Chester Beatty papyri, or the CPB. These were discovered in 1930, and they're considered to be, about 100 to 150 years older than some of our earliest copies we'd had up to that point, which means they were produced probably in the early 3rd century, around 220, this is saying. And it's very similar to our later manuscripts. So this is one of those really early manuscripts that helps to show that the text of the New Testament has changed very little over time. And we have three major codices. Codices is the plural of codex. Remember, codex was like a book. So for the Chester Beatty papyri, we have three major codices. The Papyrus 1 contains parts of all four Gospels and Acts. Again, when it was the original, probably had the entire thing, but things get lost over time. It's from around 220. Papyrus 2, from around 200, contains 8 Pauline epistles and part of Hebrews. So it's very likely that this was originally part of a collection of all of Paul's epistles, because it does appear that Paul's epistles were being circulated as a unit very early on. And this is probably something like that. And if it included Hebrews, it probably was put together by someone who believed that Paul wrote Hebrews. And Papyrus 1 is P45, Papyrus 2 is P46, then Papyrus 3, I don't have a picture of that. Papyrus 3 is P47, and it's a little bit later. It was written around 250, and it's a portion of Revelation. So again, these are some very extensive early manuscripts. And again, as you can tell they're papyri. Look at the edges. You can see the strips and everything. Then we have the Bodmer manuscripts, also 3 different papyri. This is P66, written about AD 200, contains nearly all of the first 14 chapters of the Gospel of John. Interestingly, it also contains some fairly unique readings. So there are some passages in John in P66 that read differently than they do pretty much anywhere else. Probably just, a scribe made some mistakes, was sloppy or something. There's also, I don't have pictures of it, but there's also P75 that was written between 175 and 225. It's actually a single choir codex of Luke and John. So they're able to get all of Luke and John into a single choir, a single little sewed together piece of paper. Plus, it also contains 102 pages of an original text. So someone's own writing that we just don't have anywhere else. And then the third Bodmer manuscript is P72, and it contains the epistles of Peter and Jude. Questions?
Where are all of these manuscripts stored?
Various museums, usually universities, some in private collections. Like, the reason they're called like Chester Beatty and Bodmer, usually those are indicating they're someone's private collection. But there are some are still being held in like various monasteries and stuff, just out all over the place as well. So not all of them are being kept in the best conditions. Private collectors usually know what they're doing and can store them well. Museums will, but a lot of monasteries, they don't treat them well at all. So, some of these, there are loads of manuscripts out there that we're still in kind of a rush to discover before whoever has them just completely ruins them. Now, next we have the Oxyrhynchus papyri. Oxyrhynchus there. And the Oxyrhynchus papyri was found in basically a trash dump outside a city in Egypt. Consists of thousands of Greek and Latin documents dating from between the 2nd and the 6th centuries. Some of them are biblical works, some of them are very much not biblical works. In fact, a lot of the Gnostic writings that we talked about last time were first discovered in the Oxyrhynchus papyri. So it's sort of a whole range. But it does include some of the earliest extant New Testament manuscripts. This is one of the more interesting ones, Oxyrhynchus P115. Not incredibly early as things go. We're running around 8300. It contains Revelation 13:18, which is what gives the number of the beast. Beast number of man is 666. But this gives the number of beasts as 616. And this is actually a big deal. There are not many manuscripts that give the number of beasts as 616, but they tend to be very reliable and important ones. So there's a big debate among biblical scholars as to whether the number of the beast is actually 666 or 616. And we'll talk about this when we do, textual criticism. But the number of the beast is probably the most prominent Christian doctrine that's in question due to textual variants. And there's a reason why you get this. And it all comes down to what the number of the beast means. And many scholars will say, and I'm kind of this opinion too, that 666 is from Nero Caesar. If you take Nero Caesar, because Latin and Greek and Hebrew all use their letters as numerals. So basically, you write out someone's name and you add up the number values of every letter in his name, and that was the number of their name. That was a big deal back then. It wasn't just the Apostle John that was doing that. So if you take Neron Kaiser, which is Greek for Nero Caesar, and add it up, you get 666. If you take his name, I think in Hebrew or Greek, I forget which language is which, but one language gives you 666, the other one gives you 616. So it's very possible that people were changing the number depending on their audience. So question is, what's the original? That's a big debate. We aren't sure what the original was. Something else interesting to point out here. See these lines above some of the letters? That's what's known as the nomen sacrum. And it was the way they had in writing biblical manuscripts of sort of highlighting things like the name of God or Christ or some important concepts. And what they would do is they take the word and they only write like the first and the last letter, and they write a line across the top of it. And that's what they're doing here. Like, you have X, so chi, iota, S, a sigma. I think that would probably be Christ or something like that. But that was a very common thing. So that was one of the ways in these biblical manuscripts they would highlight the names of God and of Jesus. So that's one of the Oxyrhynchus papyri. Again, there were thousands of them. A lot of them biblical, but a lot of them Gnostic and others as well. Here's another one. Oxyrhynchus 654. This is a fragment of the earliest known fragment of the Gospel of Thomas. Remember, this was one of the big Gnostic Gospels. And in fact, it might have been from one of the Oxyrhynchus that was like the first fragment that we had of it. Because for a long time, we only knew the Gospel of Thomas from it being referenced in the writings of the Church Fathers. Basically them arguing against it. We didn't actually find any copies of it until fairly recently. And I think the Oxyrhynchus papyri is where we actually got some of the earliest fragments of it. Okay, now on to the big ones. Going into now some of the best and most important New Testament manuscripts that we have. This is Codex Sinaiticus. This is the manuscript. It is so important, actually, that instead of giving it a normal capital letter like the other big manuscripts, A, B, or C, they call it Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it's like number one. Codex Sinaiticus, written around 350. It contains the entire Septuagint, including the Apocrypha, and the entire Greek New Testament, as well as the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. So two of those orthodox but non-biblical books we were talking about last time. Very, very high quality parchment manuscript. Contains virtually the entire Bible. It does have some gaps. It's not complete, but it's very close to complete. And it's usually considered to be the most significant biblical manuscript ever discovered. And the story of its discovery is interesting. We'll talk about that at the end. If you want to see it, go to the British Library. I've seen it there. I've been there. I've seen it. It's very cool. And, this picture is actually kind of boring. It's just like text. There's some very nice illuminations, pictures and stuff, and the artwork in it as well. So this is a very, very high-quality manuscript, very well preserved. It's thought that it's very likely that this was one of 50 pulpit Bibles commissioned by the Emperor Constantine. He commissioned 50 very, very nice, high-quality biblical manuscripts to be used as Bibles in churches. And it's thought that Sinaiticus might have been one of them. Next, we have sort of the number 2, and that is Codex Vaticanus. The name comes from the fact that it's currently kept in the Vatican Library. Sinaiticus is called that because it was discovered at Mount Sinai. We'll talk about that in a bit. But the Codex Sinaiticus, or B, it's referred to as capital B, written about the same time as, Vaticanus is B, written about the same time as Sinaiticus, might also have been one of those 50 pulpit Bibles commissioned by Constantine. It was originally a complete Bible. Portions have been lost over time. It also includes the complete Apocrypha, except for 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It's second only to Codex Sinaiticus in its importance. Again, it's very, very high quality, very good, very accurate text. And again, when I talk about significant, I'm talking about the fact that we still use Sinaiticus and Vaticanus as references for our current biblical text. They're that well preserved. So Vaticanus is B. Then we have Alexandrinus, which is capital A. It's a bit later, written around 425. Also originally a complete Bible, but portions have been lost over time. It does include the entire, or would have originally included the entire Bible. Also has 1st and 2nd Clement. Remember I mentioned 1st Clement was written by a bishop of Rome, late 1st century, just basically him writing to another church. 2nd Clement is essentially a sermon. It's like a written down sermon. Probably not by Clement. It was originally attributed to him, but most scholars now don't think it was him. It's probably much later. I've read it. I don't remember much about it. Also has the Psalms of Solomon, so another apocryphal book. But again, it's given a capital letter designation at capital A, so it's also very important. You see it's very nicely done. Does have some notes in the side, probably on textual variants and the like. Now, Codex Ephraemi is kind of weird. It's a vellum codex, so it would have been very expensive, very, very highest quality material. Originally contained the entire Bible, but is now a palimpsest. One of those that have been scraped off and new material written on it, and you can see that. You can see that something has been written over something that was there before. So the Bible would have been what was scraped off, and when they scraped it off, they used the now blank pages to record sermons. So they scraped off the original Bible that was there and used it to record some guy's sermons. But again, with modern technology, that allows us to recover the original text. So also written around 450, about the same time as Alexandrinus. Again, a very important manuscript. Codex Beatty is another weird one. Y'all have heard of like interlinear Bibles that have like the Greek and the Hebrew and the English. This is the same thing, but with Greek and Latin. So Codex Beatty, Codex Sinaiticus, the one last one we looked at, that's capital C. That's what they call it. Codex Beatty is capital D. Also written around 450, so about the same time as Alexandrinus and Ephraimi. Contains parallel Latin and Greek on opposite pages. Contains most of the four Gospels, again in that Western order. So like, I forget what the order was. It was a different order. Along with a small fragment of 3rd John. Beatty, it also contains Acts, at least most of Acts. Beatty has a lot of very bizarre variant readings. So you get versions of the text in Beatty you really don't see anywhere else. And there have been some weird claims made for the Codex Beatty we'll talk about next time or maybe in our last class. Basically, there's been at least one scholar who claimed that Codex Beatty is the original and everything else is, mistaken. Now, this is Codex Washingtonianus, not because it was written by George Washington. It's kept in D.C. Because it's Washingtonianus, it's capital W. So it's referred to as capital W. Written AD 475, so a little bit later. This is actually right around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, was when this was made. Interestingly, it contains the four Gospels, again in that Western order, but it lacks two disputed passages. It lacks the pericope adulterae, the story of Jesus with the woman accused of adultery, which is now known to almost certainly not be original. We'll talk about that. But the story of Jesus and the woman in adultery was almost certainly not in the original gospel as John wrote it. It was added later. That doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it was added later. It also includes what's known as the Phreologian or the long ending of Mark. If you look in your Bible at the ending of the Gospel of Mark, what you have is the ending. Everything past Book 8 is also not original. Verse 8 is also not original. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail in a couple weeks. But Washingtonianus replaces the ending that we have with a longer ending known as the Phreologian, which, Oh, I'm sorry. So it wasn't Beatty that people claimed was the original. It was Washingtonianus. In 2006, there were a couple of scholars who claimed that the Codex Washingtonianus was the original, as in the original autograph written by the original apostles. And he actually claimed that they had been signed and dated by the original authors. So you have an autographed copy of the Bible. Not surprisingly, no other biblical scholars have accepted that. But even though, it does have some differences, it's still a very old manuscript, compared to a lot of them, still very important. So that's all we have in terms of pictures. Like I said, I'll put the PowerPoint up in the same folder where I have the recordings so you can look at them. So before we end today, quick story about how the Codex Sinaiticus was discovered, because it's interesting. And it was discovered by a man named Constantine von Tischendorf, which is not a villain in some old movie. He actually really was the Christian Indiana Jones. Constantine von Tischendorf was a professor at the University of Leipzig. And he spent much of his life searching for biblical manuscripts. And his goal was to find all these old manuscripts and try to recover the original text. Because what we think of as biblical textual criticism, which we'll talk about next week and the week after, was still very much in its infancy here. So he was one of the first who were really trying to recover this original text by finding old manuscripts. He was the one who discovered the Codex Ephraemi, and he discovered it in the National Library of Paris. They just had it. No one knew what it was. A lot of these libraries, these museums, they have loads and loads of old manuscripts. They have not been gone through. No one knows what they are. So he discovered Codex Ephraemi there. And he was the first to realize, and he was the first to actually transcribe the original biblical writing underneath what had been written over it. Remember, Ephraemi was the palimpsest. So he was the first one to do that. On one of his, worldwide trips to discover manuscripts, he went to the monastery of St. Catherine, which is at the foot of Mount Sinai. So you have a monastery there. This was in 1844. And he found a large basket just filled with manuscripts. And a lot of these were scriptural manuscripts written in majuscule. They only allowed him to take about 40 pages. And I'm trying to remember if it was this one or another one, but they had actually been using these manuscripts to kindle fires. That might not have been this one, but there's some story where that did happen, where he found these old manuscripts that they've been using just to light fires. So he was only allowed to take a few pages of that, but another monk did show him a much larger, extensive biblical manuscript. And Tischendorf was able to negotiate to that monk to allow him to take the manuscript back to Leipzig. And that's where you actually got the Codex Sinaiticus. It was this old manuscript that has been sitting in this monastery for 1,500 years, probably. And Tischendorf discovered it, brought it back to the university, put it all together because it wouldn't have all been in one piece. But he put it all together and edited it, and published it. And by publishing, it just means, he made it available. And as we said, the Codex Sinaiticus really serves as our foundational biblical text now. It is the foundation for the most accurate text of the New Testament we've ever found.
Tell me somebody's not been back to that.
Oh, they have. In fact, they went back in 1975 and found 1,000 additional manuscripts.
It took them 130 years to figure that out.
And in fact, when they went back there, they found 12 additional pages to the Codex Sinaiticus.
Do you think they ought to go back now?
I'm sure they have. I'm sure it's been, searched, thoroughly by this point.
Yeah.
But it's, like I said, a lot of these old manuscripts were just sitting around in monasteries. They were being used to light fires. They were being used to, write notes on. They hadn't been taken good care of at all. And scholars had to come and, basically show these people what they had. Interestingly, Constantine von Tischendorf was fairly liberal. I don't think he believed in biblical inerrancy or anything like that, but he was a biblical scholar who wanted to figure out the original text. So that's all I have to say about manuscripts. So this is kind of a lead-in to our last couple of weeks where we'll talk about using these manuscripts to try to determine the original text of the Bible. What did the Bible actually say? Is the Bible we have now accurate? Has it been changed through transmission? Has it been altered, etc.? Any last questions?